Hi, John Seed.
Hi, Lydia.
I'm very grateful to have you as part of our Great Turning Summit. You have been a hero of mine just in my own lifetime. And so we're very excited to hear some of your perspective on the Great Turning. Um, I'd like to first ask you, what are some things that you love about being alive in Earth?
Well, I love the extraordinary opportunity of being alive in the middle of the sixth mass extinction to take place in the last 4.5 billion years. And it just gives such a extraordinary context to life and such an extraordinary motivation to do whatever I can. So it just seems like a very special time to be alive and I love it.
What do you love about it?
Well, I love the way that it burns away ridiculous distractions.
Mm.
That there's something so important going on that it's very easy for me to find motivation and vision and direction under these circumstances.
There's like a clarifying fire.
Exactly.
And it seems like you felt that for a long time.
I have, yeah. It started very suddenly in 1979, and it's been at the at the root of my life ever since.
It seems like the root has been arising within you, like from that root, whether it's from your human identity root or your ecological identity root, that there was a transformative experience that you had where you felt that you were becoming the rainforest protecting herself rather than a separate human protecting the rainforest. Is that the moment that you're referencing? Yeah.
Yes, it is in August of 1979 when just by some sheer fluke I found myself participating in what years later we realised was the first direct action in defence of rainforests, and something happened to me there that has transformed my life, and I hitched my wagon to that star and have been hanging on for dear life ever since.
And then what do you feel you're in collaboration with? What have you felt in different moments, or what do you feel you're in collaboration with in your life?
Intellectually, I realise that I am part of the earth, that I have no independent existence. That's the fundamental deep ecology insight. And that as part of the earth, if I think of myself as a cell in the body of the earth or something like that, then some kind of communication is possible, so that when I surrender to that kind of an insight, then I can feel bubbling up in me enthusiasms and visions and impulses. And I can trust that those are like orders. I can feel that them as kind of not so much as me personally having an opinion, but rather having surrendered to the earth that I receive directions and I gratefully accept those directions and surrender to them.
So, I want to talk a little bit about the ways that you have helped shape the great turning from your personal life in your lifetime. And we have this idea of going through and looking at it from the perspective of the three dimensions of the great turning, that great teaching from Joanna Macy. So the first dimension of the great turning is holding actions, anything that helps to slow down destruction and buy time. What are some ways that you have engaged with that in your life and contributed?
Yeah, and I'd like to talk about that, but maybe I'll introduce it by saying that one of the really important things about the great turning and this way of framing things is that, that I started my life as an activist with this first aspect of actions to slow damage to the earth and her beings. But, in that world, it's quite common to find people who are exasperated and who just say, if only everyone was doing what I'm doing, everything would be okay. And what the Great Turning shows us is that there's actually a number of different things, all of which need to be done, that don't necessarily look exactly the same as each other. And when we see somebody else who's doing, for example, working on the shift in consciousness rather than the holding actions, or working on an analysis of structural causes and so on, that we can be celebrating that, and we can recognize that we're all on the same page and that we're working together to the same great end. So having said that, yes, since 1979, I've been involved in actions to slow the damage, especially concerning rainforests, which was my first great love and remains, what I'm working on to this day, and have had some success with that. But we, in Australia, we were able to um, slow the destruction of first the um, subtropical rainforests in my home state of New South Wales in 1979 to 81, then the temperate rainforests in the island state of Tasmania, and finally the tropical rainforests in far north Queensland. And in each case, national parks and eventual World Heritage listing rewarded our efforts. And I went on from there to working in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Australia's two closest neighbours, and then from there to India and Ecuador, and then to other forest types in Siberia and in many, many different parts of the world, and created an institution, the Rainforest Information Centre, populated entirely by volunteers. And so I started out with direct action of tree huggers, chaining ourselves to machinery and um, like that. But obviously then all kinds of other, raising awareness, strategizing, especially I've been really involved in creating projects in um, underdeveloped countries where most of the rainforests in the world outside the Australian rainforest are in what we would call underdeveloped or third world countries, and that creating projects that address the need for some kind of benign, sustainable economic development to replace the loss of revenue and income that comes if we just stop the logging. You can't just stop the logging and leave the poorest people in the world to pay the price economically. So that we've especially worked with the Australian Government Development Assistance Bureau. The government has given us grants to create sustainable development projects in third world countries tied to the conservation of rainforests.
And then moving into the second dimension of the great turning, the I now call it new and remembered Gaian systems. New and remembered, regenerative, sustainable, whatever word you want to put there, systems, ways of organizing life that helps to sustain life. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about your hands in and experiences within that realm of the great turning.
When I think of it that way, I realize that my involvement in that aspect actually predated the direct actions and the holding actions,
Mm.
because I became interested in community, and back in 1975, um, helped to build a meditation centre in the forest in northern New South Wales, and then to start um, a community called Bodie Farm, where 20 of us bought shares and we started living together, organising meditation retreats, growing our own food, delivering our own babies, building our own houses. And as you say, very old, remembered kind of that this is really how we're meant to live. We're not meant to live where we don't know the name of the person who lives next door to us, and where we live in these isolated kind of lives. And there's something extraordinarily um, joyous that blossoms in us when we find a way to live in community together. And it's not easy. We have to figure out how to make decisions and how to deal with conflict and all kinds of things. But from that first community to this day where now I live in the Narara Eco Village, just north of Sydney, where there are about 150 of us. And, I've got a 9-year-old son, and he wanders out with his posse in the morning, and we might not see him till night. And there's a 10 km/h speed limit on the roads. And when I walk through the street, I smile at everyone that I pass and greet everyone that I pass. I know everyone. And it just feels so right. It just feels like this is how it's always been. This is how it was when we moved from our pre-human to human. It was always the community that moved together, and to reconnect with that, and especially this time, the Narara Eco Village sees itself as a kind of a model for what, we're creating it in a way that makes it as accessible as possible, and that
Mhm.
it's called a demonstration eco village. But it's also something that's not available for everybody at the moment
Yeah,
for all
it's so
kinds of
real.
reasons. And so it's really creating the models to show, you know, and to show how it works, and also creating the models of architecture, and creating the models of food growing, and creating the models of how to deal with local government to allow this kind of thing to take place. I see it as kind of building the framework of the new, even while the tail of the dinosaur is still thrashing all around us, and
Right.
like that.
Yeah. Beautiful. Any other reflections you want to offer on this kind of systems, new and remembered Gaian systems?
Besides the creation of structural alternatives, for me, this second dimension of the Great Turning includes the analysis of structural causes. And I've certainly been involved in analysis of the World Bank and the multilateral development banks, and the impact that their project have on environmental destruction is enormous. And likewise, the religion of economics that I've criticised, the economics claims to be a science, but it's actually a religion, and I've written to, in my opinion, proves that that's the case. That to have the idea that we can have the infinite growth, endless growth on a finite planet is a kind of a religious faith, and everything about economics is based upon that faith. And so I deny that. I wish to undermine that faith, because I feel like these things, as long as they remain in place, then all of the other things that we're doing are either impossible or far more difficult than they need to be. And so that's the other area of the second dimension of the Great Turning that I've been involved in.
That's amazing. I haven't read that part of your work, but that the principle or the value system or the assumption that infinite growth is possible based off of finite resources, to say that that's kind of like it's like a pillar of worldview more than it is a pillar of scientific explanation, to say that there's a kind of faith in that.
I mean, if we see economics as religion, then advertising becomes religious education, and there's more money spent on religious education than there is on, like, it's one of the
Wow.
hugest expenditures that there is to continue to convince us that we're going to be happy if only we consume more of this, that, and the other thing.
And I also appreciate how it flips into the third dimension shifts in consciousness, because when you live and many of us live in societies where uh, Brian Swim gave me this term, mechanomorphize the world and all living things. We project machine-like qualities onto them. And the difference between a machine and a living thing would be the existence of an internal reflective landscape. And so, of course, shifts in consciousness would be something that is undervalued often in our society or even in our movement spaces as a fundamental part of the Great Turning. But asking and looking at, what do we experience? how's our emotional body doing? What is our spiritual landscape saying? What is our moral landscape? That all of those things are also invaluable. And that shifts in consciousness is an absolutely critical part of the great turning as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because my involvement with this part of the Great Turning grew out of the first piece of the holding actions, because in the mid 1980s, when we'd had these tremendous successes in Australia in protecting our rainforests through direct action and campaigning, um, I found myself in the mid 80s realizing that in spite of those successes, worldwide, for every forest that had been protected over the last decade, 1,000 forests had been lost. And clearly, there was no way that we could save the planet one forest at a time. That unless we could address the underlying spiritual disease that allows modern humans to imagine that we can somehow profit from the destruction of our own life support systems, these actions would amount to nothing as far as the future of the world was concerned. And it was these musings that eventually led me to the philosophy of deep ecology. Um, so that's a term coined by late Arne Ness, who was the professor of philosophy at Oslo University. And according to him, underlying all of the symptoms of the environmental crisis, there is the illusion of separation between human beings and the rest of the natural world, the illusion of separation. And this illusion, he claimed, was a result of anthropocentrism, or human-centeredness, or human supremacy, this idea that we are the center of everything. And so the science of ecology and the wisdom of indigenous people suggests that we're just one strand in the web of life, whereas this anthropocentrism claims that we're the spider in the middle of the web and everything else is there just to support us. All the rest of the web is just there as a support system for us. And economics then says that all value is created by human beings, that nothing has any value until humans add their labor and intelligence to it. The earth itself is just dirt until we turn it into something valuable. Trees are of no value until they're cut down and turned into wood chips or whatever it is. And Arne Ness said that ecological ideas won't save us. What we need is ecological identity or ecological self. And we need community therapies to nourish that ecological identity. And so deep ecology was just ecological ideas until I met Joanna. And then through her work, which she then called in those days despair and empowerment, um, by combining that with the ideas of deep ecology, we created the experiential deep ecology therapies, like the Council of All Beings and the deep ecology workshops, which I continue to facilitate, and really the work that reconnects that grew out of all of that.
I'd love to hear like a little window more into what it was like when you encountered Joanna and her work, because it seems to me like there are certain moments that we encounter in our lives that tend to be big pivots for us, or big doorways are opened. For Joanne, I remember talking to her about when she first encountered systems theory and how she was basically running around the living room crying in elation because she was it was a pivot moment for her. And I guess it seems to me like for her, meeting you was something similar. And I don't know if it, you know, what it was like for you necessarily, but I imagine that it was a big moment for you as well.
Oh, absolutely. It was one of the handful of big moments in my life. And that I finally felt like uh, the door opened and the direction forward emerged. You know, what she taught me about the importance of the feelings that we normally suppress was pivotal for me, both personally, that you know that what I now understand as a result of what she taught me was that these feelings that, you know, are never welcome in polite company, of anguish, distress, despair, terror, and rage, that these things are part of our ancestral intelligence. That so 99.9999% of our um, evolution, we hadn't grown this big bulge over our nose. We weren't thinking our way through the world. We were making our decisions based upon what we now call feelings. You can call it instinct or intuition, but what we call feelings is what remains of this ancient, time-tested intelligence, tested in every single generation by natural selection, that um, any uh, any lack of accuracy in our ability to feel our way through the world and to understand what was going on based upon our feelings meant that you didn't leave your genes in the gene pool. And so that these feelings are an incredibly important part of our intelligence, and they're pushing up with a huge energy to warn us about what's happening in our world. We see what's happening to our world, and the feelings are wanting to tell us something, and we're pushing back with this social, it'd be embarrassing, people wouldn't like me, whatever it is, we're pushing back down. And our life force is frittered away with this futile battle of instinctual energy being pushed down by social conditioning. And what remains at the end of that is a kind of a flat paralysis. Um, it's too hard. What can one person do anyway? It's too late, and so on. And that when, in the way that Joanna taught me, we invite that energy, when we create a safe container where that energy can express itself and be heard by our people, then that all of that energy is liberated, both the instinctual energy and the energy used to repress it. And we experience that then as empowerment. We experience this enormous rush of enthusiasm and understanding and so on. So that was just incredibly important for me to learn. And it's been a central part of my life and teaching ever since.
It's very beautiful to imagine the two of you meeting and what, because we know some of what ensued. Now that I have kind of integrated more of a deep ecology perspective into the way that I experience things, I tend to feel often like when emotions are coming up, grief or fear or rage around what's happening in the planet, it is integrity trying to come back into our ecosystems. It's integrity trying to come back into the system, because that grief would say, well, something's being mistreated that I'm connected to, whose life I care about, or some boundary is being crossed that is has a lack of integrity, or I'm afraid of something that's very valid to be afraid from, and we could pivot to be more protective of ourselves from that fate. And that shift was so critical for me, um, because it helps me understand myself and the world in a way that just makes sense to me.
And so many of us now have the right ideas, but without the passion of the feelings to support those ideas, the ideas are kind of sterile, and it's almost worse than not knowing. We know, but we don't have
Right.
the strength or the passion to actually follow that knowing through with some kind of changes in our life. And so there's something so marvelous about seeing people at the end of a weekend where all of this new energy is there, and the opportunity and the courage to move forward and to actually start to figure out how to make changes in our own lives that make us more available for the great work that
Yeah.
faces us.
What would you say to someone who says, I'm afraid to care because I'm afraid my own powerlessness will be proven to me?
I do understand that, and I'm not sure that there's anything that I can give other than my own testimonial, which
Mm.
is that uh, I'm a really ordinary, broken person, and by um, surrendering to the world and by giving myself over to the world, I haven't had to rely upon my own personal power, which is minuscule, and which is, that by um, using Joanna's work and the understandings of deep ecology to allow my roots to go deep into the earth, and by inviting the energy of the earth through those roots to flow through me, um, I've been able to do really very powerful things, and there's nothing personal about it. Like if it had depended upon my personal power, none of it could possibly have happened. But we are cells in the body of the earth, and when we align ourselves to that larger body, when we recognize that larger body and align ourselves, then many things become possible. And it's a kind of more than half a lifetime of have I found this to be true.
Wow, that's amazing. I love that. I love the invitation of that. Of course. How could it be dependent only upon our personal power? That would be the perspective of that is so small compared to being part of a very big living world that is absolutely interconnected with itself. So that's it's very
But
liberating to
let
listen
me
to you
just
say that.
let
Yeah.
me just add one thing, which is like a practice that sometimes I fall back on, is that when I feel powerless and when I feel disconnected and when I've lost my way, um, then um, I can go to a forest and lie down and cover myself in leaves and surrender to the earth, and just put out through my mind this plea. Um, I'm ready for some more vision. I'm ready for some more direction. Please show me the way. And then I just get up and I brush myself off. And whatever I'm enthusiastic about after that, I take that to be the direction that I'm looking for. It's not like I don't hear the voice of the earth or anything like that. It's just I hear my own enthusiasm, and somehow there's lots of energy that comes in behind it.
Mm. All right. Um, Last question from me for now is how do you experience the great turning these days?
The ways that I experience it in my life is I've found more and more people flocking to the experiential deep ecology workshops that I'm facilitating. The workshops are full, and there are long waiting lists. I'm training a whole bunch of would-be facilitators, and so I feel um, it's a little bit early to be confident about it. But what I see happening is congruent with a kind of a virtuous J curve. We've had all of the horrible J curves of climate destruction and so on, and a virtuous J curve of more and more people being drawn to wanting to experience these changes from merely social identity to being able to embody their ecological identity and identify with and act from their ecological identity. So it feels like um, the great turning is quickening in that arena. And then in terms of my activism, we've worked in Ecuador for more than 30 years, protecting rainforest in that country and indigenous communities in that country. And Ecuador is unique as the first country in the world to include the rights of nature in its constitution. Bolivia has now joined Ecuador in that, but Ecuador was the first to do so. And that clause in the constitution had never had any teeth until um, about a year ago, um, a culmination of a series of legal cases that we had launched to protect our own Los Cedros Biological Reserve in the Andes from mining by um, on on the strength of the rights of nature clause in the Constitution. And the Supreme Court of Ecuador, the Constitutional Court, to everyone's amazement, ruled in our favour, ejected the mining company. And so now there's a precedent where it's not only that the rights of nature are in the Constitution, but now have the law, a legal precedent behind them. And so in the last 12 months, another 2 court cases based upon that precedent have succeeded in the lower courts. I feel like the great turning is quickening in that arena as well.
It's good to hear. Um, well, I appreciate you sharing with us this window into how the Great Turning has moved through Gaia as John Seed. And I know it's just a little window into a much bigger path and lifetime. And I'm just curious if you have any closing words that you want to share with folks at this Great Turning Summit.
Well, for some reason, what occurs to me is a story about one of the ancestors of the deep ecology movement, the great American poet Gary Schneider, who died not long ago. And there's a story about Gary that in the 1970s, he was working in the administration of Jerry Brown, who was the governor of California at that time. And one day, Jerry Brown says to him, Gary, why is it that whatever the issue, you're always going against the flow? And Gary replied, Jerry, what you call the flow is just the 16,000-year eddy. I'm going with the actual flow. And so I just leave with those words that somehow I think what we have to do is to recognize that this world that we're living in is just a 16,000-year eddy, and that somehow we have to be part of aligning that eddy with the flow, which is what I think the great turning, that's just another way of expressing the great turning.
That's awesome. Um, well, from everyone at School for the Great Turning, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for Thank you for not turning away. Thank you for sustaining the gaze. Thank you for continuing to give, because it just shows folks like me what's possible and what it looks like to live a life where you do your best to stay in that clarifying fire and to give what you can while you're here because you love the world, because that's what makes sense to you. So thank you for being that example. And thank you so much for being with us here at the summit.
Thank you, Lydia.